Welcome back to Albums of a Year. And today we are going to be talking about albums from the year 2003.
This year is a very strange year in that it started out like, oh yeah, I know some albums from this year when we were choosing it, and then over the span of our like listening and exploring this, I noticed more and more that I know so many albums from this year, and so many of them are very good albums, and I'm like, what the heck? So, very interestingly, I explored like 30 albums from this year that I like hadn't listened to before, I hadn't really gotten into, and as we'll see, all of the ones that are in my top 5 are ones that I knew before.
Okay.
Which, yeah, interesting. But
For me, I definitely knew a few albums going in. Like I had kind of my favorites that happened to be from this year as well. But in exploring, 30 or so albums as well, I came to like a lot that I'd never heard of before. Bands, artists that I'd literally never heard of before that have released really good music in 2003. What do you think were kind of the major musical trends in 2003? What genres were popular and what kind of artists were taking off?
so there's a lot of like indie in general. Indie rock, indie folk, kind of shoegazy stuff that was more like coming off of shoegaze. You also got a bunch of like kind of post-rock things, though a lot of them do seem to be, I guess some of them like tread new ground and try new things, but most of them seem to be pretty derivative of older like 90s post-rock.
Well, yeah, I mean, pretty much like with Sigur Rós and Godspeed, the kind of like turn of the millennium, post-rock had reached its heights, and then these bands, you can already tell, are sort of retreading that ground. They sound a bit like imitations, but still release some good albums.
Yeah.
So yeah, post-rock, indie in general, but like indie, I think you can break it down a little bit more. Like there's like the dream pop-ish indie. There's also like garage rock indie,
Yes.
right? And like just straight up alternative rock. There's also like the kind of new metal grunge strain of indie, which actually was more in the mainstream.
Yeah.
And then there's also indie folk and indie tronica.
Metal was pretty big. I feel like I like to split metal into 2 different categories. There's kind of like the cheesy, upbeat, Nightwish type of metal. Sorry if you like Nightwish. It's good. I get the appeal. But it's a lot more kind of simple, not dark, not abrasive, not difficult to listen to. And then there's the other side of metal, which is what people usually think of if they're like, oh, I don't like metal. And this is more abrasive, almost like more hardcore punk aligned metal.
Yeah.
Stuff that is like thrash metal, or like it has like really loud, almost like just bashing your ears in. That stuff is what more this year, at least in my experience, was more part of, and that's like my favorite part of like my favorite type of metal. So
it seems like metal by 2003 had already split off into many subgenres. Like in the 90s, it was kind of still starting to break off from just heavy metal, which was the 80s basically.
Yeah.
But in the 90s you had like the kind of the big genres like groove metal, sludge metal, stoner metal, death metal, of course.
Yeah.
And by 2003, it seems like they've already split off into like subgenres. Another genre, of course, that's really big in 2003 is hip hop. And I think hip hop in this point is kind of coming off of the so-called golden age, like in the 90s where you had like the kind of like, the gangster rap, which was so popular and big, like artists like the Wu-Tang Clan or like Dr. Dre or like 50 Cent. And like you're in a transition period in 2003 where like that's still popular. But there's a slow transition going on in hip hop away from just rapping about those things into something a little more like nuanced or like more emotional, I guess. But I think that we're still in 2003. We're still not there yet. It's still almost there, but we're getting close. And I think the person that really tips that off in the year to come is Kanye West. But he didn't release his first album until 2004. So like he's producing songs. For example, on one of the albums I'll be talking about, he produced I think 2 or 3 tracks from that album, and you can feel his style on it perfectly. And like you can tell that's the way hip hop is going, but it's just or on the tipping point in 2003. So it's a really cool year for that. There's a lot of good hip hop that came out this year. So let's start. And going with the top 5s, of course, we'll go always with you first. What was your number 5 album?
My 5th place is Lesser Matters by the Radio Department. Very kind of like lo-fi dream pop album that is, I don't know, it really touched me. It had like tracks that were really catchy, little catchy hooks. And then they're pretty short tracks, and then you go to the next track, and it's like, oh, this is a fun little catchy hook again. And then the next time you listen to them, there's almost like an added layer of depth where it's like, ooh, this like hits a little deeper. It's not just a whimsical, fun little melody. It's like it's actually a little bit more moving. And with future listens, it kind of just keeps hitting a little bit deeper, which I appreciate.
Yeah, so my number 5 was Velocity Design Comfort by Sweet Trip. So this album is so cool to me because I really don't think there's any other album like it that I've ever heard, and even by the same artist. Like, it's an almost perfect fusion between two genres that shouldn't work together whatsoever. Because you have like IDM in the style of like Aphex Twin's Drux, right? Which is from 2001. It's like really like fast paced, drill and bass beats, with skittering, drum machines and squelchy synths. And then at the same time, you have like 90s shoegaze and alt rock. Mm-hmm. And they clash together to make this like actually really perfect combo. It's so cool how streamlined the sound is and how like experimental the production is. The album is like interesting the whole way out. At the same time, it's like a total bliss out experience. Mm-hmm. I really like this one. I listened to it a couple times, and every time I listened to it, it grew on me more. I think it's just a really cool, like one of a kind experience. I also love the aesthetic they're going for on the album, which is sort of like this like idea of being inundated with advertisements.
Yeah.
Of like like kind of perfect architecture. It's almost like proto vaporwave in its aesthetic. Although the sound of this album is very unlike vaporwave in many ways, but like the kind of aesthetic and the design of it. Even if you look at the album cover where it shows the kind of like, what's it called, Habitat 67, I think it's called Habitat 67, which is from Montreal. The kind of like weird like blocky architecture, right? Like it's kind of like supposed to like emulate this like weird futuristic TV channel where you just like see these weird blips of information, and then the music itself matches that in that it sounds really out of this world and futuristic. Like I think even today there's no music like this, even by Sweet Trip, who released an album in 2021 which sounded very different. So it's like it's kind of just a one-off like brilliance, and I really liked it. So that's my number 5.
Very good album. One of those albums that it's like, oh, this one's from this year, but it didn't make it on my list. But yeah, on Album of the Year I rated it an 81 next to the Radio Department one. They're both 81.
All right, so what's your number 4?
My number 4 is Absolution by Muse. I had to put this one on my list.
Let's get it out. Here.
It's not my favorite Muse album, but it is like it has really good tracks. I don't think it's like consistent in quality throughout the entire thing. But yeah, this is a stadium rock album, I guess is the genre.
I'd say it's almost symphonic rock.
Yeah,
the amount of classical elements they have in
for sure
music. Yeah. But it's also like nearly metal, but not quite.
Yeah, in some ways. It's very loudly produced for most of it. Yet while that is the case, it also has like really good dynamics throughout this album. I feel like better than Origin Asymmetry many times, which has a pretty consistent energy for most of it. This has pretty like big ups and downs throughout it, which I really do appreciate. It has many elements that are thrown in here, such as in Blackout, lots of strings and orchestral elements. And in Apocalypse Now, or Apocalypse Please, has a very bright and very in-your-face kind of sound, very brilliant sound, I guess you could say. And some of like the more heavy songs like Hysteria and Stockholm Syndrome are like just peak Muse. Some of their best tracks.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I had to include this one on here. I'm sure you'll have more to say if you include this one on your list.
Well, we'll see.
Yeah.
Cool. So my number 4 is Lesser Matters by the Radio Department.
Nice.
So there's more to say on this one. I loved it. I love the influence of bands like Slowdive, which you can definitely hear in some of the tracks, like on the vocals, the way it's produced, the way it's mixed, even like, and also influence from bands like My Bloody Valentine, which definitely probably the best shoegaze artists to ever release an album, with Loveless, which was over 10 years before this one now. And yeah, like just the way that everything sounds so hazed out, distorted at times, blissful, but also like catchy.
I think distorted is the right word. It's like hazy, because distorted has a certain like grit to it that this album doesn't have. It's very fragile.
It's very it's very fragile. Like the album does feel like it's going to kind of crumble at any moment, but it's held together by this like just passion. And I think a lot of these songs, the more I listen to them, like they really affected me like emotionally. Like whenever I came back to these songs, like it actually like it kind of pulled at my heartstrings. You know, I don't know what it was about it. It's not like I have really listened to the lyrics because you can't really make them out very often. It's more just like the melodies, the way the whole album sounds so melancholic. It's so good. Like, I think this is going to be one of my favorite kind of dream pop shoegaze albums. And I think as far as those two genres, which definitely kind of flow into one or the other over the decades, like, it's right in the middle of those styles where it has a lot of elements that later you'd see in Beach House, but also it has a lot of the elements you see in like 90s shoegaze. So that's my number 4. So what's your number 3?
My number 3 is Hail to the Thief by Radiohead. It's never been one of my favorite Radiohead albums. It just never really stood out to me. It feels I don't know. It feels like normal Radiohead, which I guess makes sense because it was kind of more improvisational and more just like you've said before, them going on autopilot a little bit. It just has so much variety in it with its sounds because they were just able to just do tons of sounds. They weren't really trying to stick to one sound and like make a concept album necessarily. It was lots of different ideas. And because of that, you can get a wide range of kind of what Radiohead can do and their skill set and all of their, I guess, strengths are shown in different ways throughout this album. I think it also just starts and ends. It's hard to say the strongest out of any Radiohead album, but it starts and ends really, really well. Like, 2 + 2 = 5 as a starting is just like amazing, and
it
like
just punches you in the face like immediately.
Yeah, and then ending with Wolf at the Door is just one of their like, it's just such a good song and such a unique sound with almost like rap singing.
Yeah.
Which Tom York almost never does.
I don't think he's ever done it again after that track. Like, yeah.
So really interesting album. And I honestly thought this when we were going into this, I was like, okay, this is going to be my first. I just assumed, and then I'm surprised it isn't. But yeah, it definitely made it on this list for sure.
So my number 3 then is Absolution by Muse.
Well, I love how we're doing this. We're like, it's perfect.
So yeah, Absolution by Muse, my second favorite Muse album. I mean, Origin and Symmetry has to be the number 1. I just think it's overall better. But I love the production on this album, as you kind of mentioned. It's very loud. But at the same time, like, I feel like the vocals are quiet and the guitars are really loud. So it's like you have certain elements pop. The drums are also really loud, actually. Yes. It really does have a lot more variety on it in terms of dynamics. Like you said, like, you know, Origin and Symmetry is more just like intense for 7 full tracks.
Yeah.
A little quiet and then back to intense. Like, this album is kind of more like you have a track that's like, you know, almost 10 out of 10 intensity. Something like Stockholm Syndrome. And then you have tracks that kind of duck down a bit and were more introspective, like Falling Away With You. And then you kind of go back to like the intensity with Hysteria. So it's a bit of like a whiplash. And I think that's what they were going for. Because like the theme of this album obviously is the apocalypse. You can see like there's like the souls ascending to heaven on the cover, right? So it's like the rapture. And so this album kind of explores like different moods. It's almost bipolar, right? And I love the use of classical music. It's a lot more prevalent on here than it was on Origin of Symmetry.
For sure.
You know, you have the full like piano concerto section of Butterflies and Hurricanes. It just kind of pauses the track to just go to like Matt Bellamy just being a virtuoso on the piano for a minute. And then it goes back to the rock. Or you have a track like Blackout, which is just like him crooning over this like beautiful orchestral kind of like string swell, ebb and flow. Really, really good. And also there's more like electronic instrumentation on this album than there was like Origin. Yeah, like there's like they use a lot of synth arpeggios, which is just such a staple of their sound because of this album. Like I love on Stockholm Syndrome when you have like the kind of like the chorus and it's the distortions gearing up and getting so loud, and then you have the chorus break in and you have like this like spiraling ascending synth line that just amplifies the music so much. Or Endlessly, as you said, which kind of has like it has like acoustic drumming, but it has everything else is like this kind of like pulsing electronic synths, which really work well, and it builds suspense for that track and add atmosphere. So yeah, also I'd say Matt Bellamy's vocals are some of the best ever on this album too. He just totally belts out. Yeah, really good album. Not my favorite from this year, but one of my favorite Muse albums for sure. And so it had to be here.
My number 2 is Death Cult Armageddon by Dimmu Borgir. This symphonic black metal album is, I think, it is the metal album that got me into metal and made me a metalhead.
Oh, nice.
Particularly the song Progenies of the Great Apocalypse.
What a title.
Yeah. Second song on this album, and it's I think still one of the best metal songs that I've ever listened to. And the rest of the album holds up, kind of keeps the same sound, though at times much less symphonic. And the symphonic elements are the parts that I love the best. They're very, very cinematic, very dramatic. They make me feel like I'm like in a Batman Gotham City situation. I don't know. I just get like Batman vibes from a lot of it.
Sweeping down and punching guys.
Yeah, well, being the punched, because you're obviously evil. Like, this album is a very evil album.
You're a supervillain.
You are an insane supervillain that's going through creating a death cult to kill people, like the Scarecrow kind of situation. Like,
okay.
You're not the good guy in this album. This album is probably one of the most evil sounding, or just Dimmu Borgir in general is one of the most evil sounding bands ever, and that just adds to their aesthetic so much.
My number 2 is Vaudeville Villain by Victor Vaughn, also known as MF Doom, or King Ghidorah, or Doom, all caps when you spell the man's name. But yeah, basically on this album, it's like a year before Mad Villainy. I think the next project he would release would be about Mad Villainy, and you can tell like this is like literally the build up to Mad Villainy, and it feels like it. It's literally just that album without Madlib on production. And of course, Madlib's production adds a ton to that album. Mm-hmm. But in this album, even without Madlib, it's awesome. It kicks so much ass. Like this album, it's totally a supervillain's album, right? Like he's playing this different persona. Well, I guess he's still Doctor Doom, but he's just going by Victor Vaughn instead. But like he still has this kind of villainous persona, and this album feels like you're in like the gutters of some like Gotham City streets, and it's kind of like a film noir setting, and he's going out. You know, he's not a do-gooder, the opposite. He's a do-eviler, and he's going around robbing places, beating up guys, you know, doing drugs and running a gang, and he's proud of it. And you just get this like really cool sort of like swagger to every track. The production on every beat is so awesome. All the songs like are just so catchy, and I just love returning to the beats and just like getting into the vibes. And then of course MF Doom's rhymes are just so good. Like he's a lyrical genius. Just the masterful lines he spins. They make me laugh, or sometimes they just feel awesome, or sometimes they're just like so impressive that I just go like, what the hell? So I love it. I think the thing that like really stands out on this album too is that there's 2 tracks that are kind of the open mic tracks. So like he raps on every track other than these 2 where he has some guests come on and just like have like a political speech that they just go off on, and then you have a narrator being like, okay, that's enough, and then they move on to another guy. It's just kind of fun. But overall it's just like, yeah, Victor Vaughn, this like, you know, villainous rapper, and he's going around and he's talking about his tall tales, and it's just a good vibe the whole time. And I have to mention the final track, which I think is a bonus track, but it starts with 5 minutes of just like rain and storm noises, and then it goes into kind of a bonus track, and so good. Yeah. That's such an important addition to this album. Absolutely. And it wouldn't be complete without it.
Absolutely.
But overall, album's nearly perfect. And honestly, it was really, really hard to put this in number 2. But I have to. Okay, so before we go into our number 1s, we're going to talk about our honorable mentions.
So my first one would be City of Dis by The Mass. This is a hardcore punk / jazz metal album. I was very close to making this my number 5, but I've been kind of cycling out number 5s for the last few days. But this album is very hardcore. There's screaming. There are really complex grooves. There's shouty kind of punk singing. The song names are amazing, like Butt Lips and... this is important that I read this out. We Enslaved Elves to Build Our Death is another one of their songs. Amazing song names, and they fit the music really well, so I had to include this one. Another one that I was wanting to add to my number 5 is Damnation by Opeth. Damnation by Opeth is like a progressive rock album in a kind of metal-esque style. It's kind of hard to call it progressive rock because it's very different than a lot of other styles, because this band started out as I think a death metal band. But then they started making progressive rock. And this album just like, it's really dramatic, emotional, melancholic. They use mellotron strings and choirs as well. Very often, almost in like a exit music for a film. This album is very much like exit music for a film.
Oh, I gotta check it out now.
Yeah, for a lot of this. And so it's very, very dramatic in that way. The third one I have to include is the Sweet Trip one that you mentioned.
Velocity Design Comfort.
Yeah, Velocity Design Comfort. It's a really good album. You've described it perfectly. I don't think there's anything I can add there, but yeah.
Okay, cool. So yeah, my honorable mentions are all very different. So first is Feedbacker by Boris. So this is there's two Boris albums released in 2003. One of them was okay. This one blew me away. So this one is a drone album, kind of. It's like drone metal. It's sort of like in the style of like Sun O, if you've heard of that band. It's a 5-track suite that's all technically the same song, split into 5 movements. And it's just this low, droning, atmospheric hellscape for 45 minutes. Occasionally, for different movements, they add in drums, or they add in incomprehensible vocals. And so, and one part, it devolves into total chaos. But overall, it's just like this dirge, kind of like something that you'd hear out of like Swan's soundtracks for the blind, but like focused in and zoomed in and stretched out until it was a whole album. Very cool and really good. And I've listened to this a lot for whatever reason, and it's good. I almost put it in my top 5. I have to mention Jay-Z's Black Album. Maximalist production. It's got Kanye West producing a few tracks. That's the one I was talking about in the intro. Every track is just so braggadocious and fun, and it's like peak gangster rap. Also funny about it is that it was Jay-Z's final album because he was like retiring, but then he just released another album in like 2 years. But like that was a big concept of this album, is that he's his curtain call. See, I'm retiring from the scene because there ain't no competition anymore. And then he just returned. But anyway, it's still a really fun album. Another one is Michigan by Sufjan Stevens. Really nice indie folk album that just explores the state of Michigan in a lot of excruciating detail, mixing in, of course, Sufjan's like personal life and backstory, and also going into different perspectives of different type of people that would live in Michigan during the kind of like, eroding financial situation going on there, and their economy that was kind of in shambles after the auto industry outsourced itself. Very, very cool album. Very beautiful. I also have to mention Broadcast's Haha Sound, another dream pop, kind of lo-fi, shoegaze album with some indie-tronica elements. It's really good. Broadcast was a great band, but there were just better albums in this genre, so I couldn't really include it. And then lastly is Metaphorical Music by Nujabes. Great kind of lo-fi hip-hop. This was his first album, and literally birthed the genre of the lo-fi anime hip-hop beats to relax and study to. But this album's so good. It's just so slick. The production's so smooth, and the songs are all like so good to just have on kind of in the background and just lighten your mood. Cool. So yeah, that's my honorable mentions, and you did yours, and now we'll go into our number ones.
Yeah, so my number 1 is The Painter's Palette by Ethel Dueth. I was very surprised because it's very obscure, so it wasn't on any of the lists for this year. So I was like, oh, this one's, once I think you mentioned it, you brought up, oh yeah, this one was one that I might listen to. And I was like, that one's this year. This is one of my favorite metal albums of all time. So I've listened to this one a lot recently, kind of getting back into it. And it's like, every listen makes it better than the last, to the point where I'm like laughing hysterically at like how good it is and how like I just am amazed pretty much every time I listen to it. And like I've worked out to most of these songs. It is a jazz metal album. That is to say, it is a kind of thrash metal or math metal or prog metal that has lots of jazzy elements, including saxophone solos, squelchy trumpet solos, background jazz instruments doing different things. It's a good album with lots of variety. Despite like on first listen, it sounds very samey, but like the more you listen to it, the more like seems to differentiate itself from other songs to the point where it's like, are these on the same album? I don't know. It's a really weird effect I've never had with any other album of like getting into an album and being like, this feels so totally different than the first time I listened to this after like 5 listens. What is your first?
So my number 1 is Hail to the Thief by Radiohead. So I was pretty confident this would be my number 1 when we started 2003. Although there were a lot of albums that almost took it down from its spot. But no, in the end, it's still my favorite of 2003. It is actually one of my favorite Radiohead albums. Not as good as like their kind of holy trinity of albums like In Rainbows, Kid A, OK Computer. I still think those are better than this one, but this is just below, in my opinion. The only reason it wouldn't be as good as those is because it's more unfocused. But I feel like in a way, it kind of works for this album. As you were saying, it's kind of an explosion of just different skills that the band had. It was the last album they had to do for their contract with EMI, the label they were on since Pablo Honey.
Mm-hmm.
And they kind of were able to do whatever the hell they wanted, and so they did. So there's like, a lot of electronic influence on songs like Backdrifts or The Gloaming, and then there's a lot of like straight up almost like punk rock on 2+2=5, but then also just completely other things they've never done before, like whatever We Suck Young Blood is, or Wolf at the Door, which has him like kind of like rap singing, and just there's so much chaos on this album, but in it just works to make this like really interesting album that like, I can listen to as a full album, start to finish, or on shuffle, or just random tracks, and it's just always good. I've just grown to like this one more and more over the years, and I think it's really underrated as far as Radiohead's discography goes. There's a lot of amazing standouts, and I think as a whole, there isn't really a weak track either. I just think that like maybe its heights aren't as high as some tracks on Kid A or whatever. But that's whatever. You're comparing Radiohead to Radiohead, so at that point it's kind of hard. Many of these tracks are from my favorite Radiohead songs, like 2+2=5, or Where I Ended You Begin, or Mixomatosis, or There. I feel like if you like Radiohead at all, don't miss this one, even though it's not as popular as the other ones. So
I can agree with that sentiment.
So anyway, that's our 2003 list. It was very fun doing 2003. One of my favorite years to explore.
I didn't really dislike any of the albums I listened to, and I explored a lot, so it was cool.
1979 was more of a mixed bag.
Yeah.
Some of the music was just very dated, and other genres that just were just bizarre to us, I think. But yeah, thanks for watching, and we'll catch you next week.
Yeah, catch you like the flu. Or like, okay, never mind. Cut that. That's not good. We don't want that.
Anyway,
Bye.
Bye.